I'm Clara Whitfield, 29, and I didn't walk into my grandfather's will reading expecting fireworks. I walked in braced for the familiar smiles that felt like glass and kindness that came with strings. The courthouse hallway smelled like lemon polish and old paper, and the echo of heels on tile made the whole place sound colder than it looked. My parents were already there in tailored calm, my brother lounging as if the chair owed him comfort. I took the seat farthest from them and kept my hands folded to stop the tremor in my fingers. Mr. Klein opened his leather folder, and the pages made a soft hiss as he turned them. The room settled into a silence you can almost taste when everyone is pretending to be patient. My grandfather's name, Henry Lawson, carried through the air like a bell struck once. I didn't know it yet, but the last door they'd kept shut on me was about to swing wide. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand your ground when someone doubted you, tap like and subscribe. So this story finds the people who need it most. I grew up in a neighborhood where the lawns matched and the curtains did not, because matching was gauche and appearances were everything. That was the Whitfield family creed, even if no one said it out loud. My father, Gerald, believed a handshake only mattered if someone important was watching, and my mother, Marlene, measured success by guest lists and table settings. I learned early that my brother Logan was the headline they wanted to read, and I was the footnote they skimmed. I wasn't a troublemaker, and I wasn't a star. I was the quiet kid who stayed late in the art room, the one who brought books to games, and preferred a half-lit window to a crowded hallway. When they hosted dinners, Logan's trophies sat like ornaments along the mantel, polished and evenly spaced. My small awards were tucked into a drawer because, as my mother put it, the room should breathe. I told myself I didn't mind, because sometimes telling yourself a thing is easier than hearing the truth from someone else. The person who never required a performance was my grandfather Henry. His house smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, and his kitchen table was scarred with little nicks from a life actually lived. When I showed him a sketch or an essay, he didn't ask what it would do for me, he asked what it meant to me. He'd pass me the salt with a half-smile and say, "You're steady, Clara. Steady gets you where you're going," and he meant it as something more than comfort. He wasn't flashy about care. He'd slide grocery money under my mug, as if it had always been there, or leave a note tucked in a jacket pocket that said, "See the world as it is, and as it could be." Around him, I could relax my shoulders and let the day fall off. Around him, I didn't have to audition for my own family. At home, the air changed as we got older, and the path narrowed into two lanes, Logan's and everything else. Logan had a new car the morning he turned 16. I learned to be grateful for rides and to plan around other people's schedules. He spoke in the easy voice of someone certain the world would present itself, and it often did. When he walked into a room, my parents straightened, as if a magazine photographer had just lifted a camera. I learned to move softly to make the table before being asked to swallow the sting when my father's praise landed on Logan and never skimmed my side of the plate. Quiet became a kind of skill. So did finding grace in small places, like a sunbeam slipping across the floor or the click of a pen when an idea finally settled where it belonged. The distance grew in inches, then yards. If I questioned why priorities tilted, my father would say that life wasn't a scale and fairness was for children. My mother would tilt her head and smile the way people do when a child says something they plan to ignore. I didn't push back hard, not then. I had learned the household weather and calm skies were safer than storms. I found work after school, saved what I could, and told myself the future would be the place where I finally made sense. Still, a small part of me hoped for a moment, any moment, when my parents would see me clearly, not as a problem to manage or a shadow behind Logan's light, but as a person carrying her own flame. The summer I turned 18, the house ran on ceremony. There were the same white plates and the same folded napkins, the same careful laughter that rose and flattened like a tide. What changed was not how they spoke, but how they watched me measuring as if the clock had a say in who I was allowed to be the next day. My father kept glancing at an envelope on the console table the way someone checks a ticket before a gate. My mother moved with the crispness of a plan that has already been set. She poured water, aligned forks, smoothed a runner that didn't need smoothing. Logan spun his car keys on one finger, an idle rhythm that made the room feel smaller. I set 4 glasses and told myself I wasn't bracing. But hands give you away. Their grip remembers what the mind tries to forget. Grandfather called that afternoon, and his voice carried the sort of warmth that makes you think of porch light and late summer. He asked if I needed anything, and I told him no, because I had learned to need as little as possible. "Steady," he said again, and I heard the smile in it. After we hung up, I stood at the sink and watched the sky go pale behind the maple tree, counting breaths, until the front door opened and evening took its place. The envelope, the quiet, the careful smiles. There are moments when a life tilts, and you can feel it tilting, yet you keep your feet planted, because moving too soon makes the floor seem farther away. When my father finally reached for the envelope, and my mother asked everyone to sit, the room felt colder than the tile at the courthouse. I didn't know the exact words yet, only that the script had been rehearsed without me. The envelope sat on the table like a quiet threat, its corners perfectly aligned with the edge of the runner. My father's fingers rested on it for a long moment before he finally broke the seal. The paper crackled as he unfolded it, and my mother's eyes gleamed, waiting for her cue. Logan leaned back in his chair, spinning his car keys the way he always did when he knew he held all the cards. My father's voice was smooth, steady as he cleared his throat. "Clara," he said, "your mother and I have discussed this. You're old enough now to stand on your own. No more money, no more support." The room went still. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to fade. "You'll learn responsibility." He added his tone, almost kind. The envelope held nothing. No check, no letter of encouragement, just a single sheet with the family crest embossed at the top, a symbol of finality. My mother smiled like it was a gift. "This is how real growth happens, darling," she said softly. Logan smirked, tapping his phone already half elsewhere. That was how they sent me off, dressed in civility, wrapped in cruelty. I packed what I could into an old canvas backpack, 2 sets of clothes, my sketchbook, and a few pencils worn down to nubs. By dusk, I was sitting in the driver's seat of my beat-up sedan parked beneath the streetlight across from our house. My hand stayed on the steering wheel even after the engine went quiet. Through the window, I could see the silhouettes moving inside the clink of glasses, the golden spill of chandelier light, the kind of warmth that had never reached me. My mother's laugh carried through the open window for a moment, sharp and practiced. I looked away. The sky had that fading purple hue that means night is near, but not yet here. I didn't cry. I just sat there until the cold crept in, then reclined the seat and tried to sleep. That was my first night on my own. The next few years blurred into a patchwork of small jobs and small apartments, one step ahead of overdue rent. I waited tables, folded shirts at a department store, answered phones for a delivery company. The days ran together, but they were mine, and that mattered more than anyone could know. Every Sunday, I'd visit my grandfather Henry at his modest home on the edge of town. He'd have a plate ready, something simple like roast chicken or soup, and he'd listen, really listen as I told him about my week. "You're steady," he'd say again, his favorite word. "The world moves fast, but you don't have to chase it." I didn't always believe him, but I liked the sound of it. Before I left, he'd tuck a folded bill into my coat pocket, pretending it wasn't there, as if dignity were a fragile thing to protect. When life was at its hardest, that steady presence kept me from drifting too far. Years passed that way quietly, stubbornly. Then, one afternoon, my phone rang. The number was familiar but distant, the way an old melody feels before you place it. It was Mr. Cole, my grandfather's attorney. His voice was careful. "Clara, I'm afraid I have bad news." The air around me changed. I didn't hear the rest right away, just the hollow tone of his words. Henry Lawson was gone. I sat down where I was on the edge of the narrow bed in my studio apartment and stared at the wall until the light changed. He'd been ill, I knew that, but I'd convinced myself he'd pull through. He always had. The days that followed moved like water, slow, colorless, impossible to hold. I went through the motions, the service, the condolences, the quiet after the crowd went home. The house smelled the same, cedar and coffee, only now it was still. I didn't expect anything more. Maybe a small keepsake, a letter. That would have been enough. Then came the envelope this time with the county seal embossed on heavy paper. "You are hereby required to attend the reading of the last will and testament of Henry Lawson," it read. My name was there alongside my parents and Logan. I almost didn't go. The thought of sitting across from them again, of their eyes flicking over me like I was still that unwanted girl, made my stomach knot. But I couldn't ignore it. Grandpa had believed in showing up even when it hurt, so I went. The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and polish, the kind of scent that clings to old records and polished floors. My parents were already seated, of course. My mother in her pearl earrings and silk blouse, my father with cufflinks that gleamed when he moved his hand. Logan wore a tailored navy suit, the same one he used for job interviews, though I doubted he needed one lately. They looked like they belonged there, like they had come to collect what was theirs. When I stepped inside, my mother's smile spread too wide, her voice sugar-sweet. "Clara." "Sweetheart," she cooed, as though we hadn't gone years without speaking. My father nodded stiffly, eyes flicking toward the attorney's briefcase, as if he could already see the balance sheet inside. Logan grinned that same practiced grin that never reached his eyes. "This will be interesting," he muttered. I took my seat opposite them. The attorney, Mr. Klein, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. His papers rustled softly as he began. "We are here to read the last will and testament of Mr. Henry Lawson." The air in the room felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were listening. My mother's hand brushed mine lightly, more a warning than affection, and her nails pressed into my skin just enough to remind me she was still in control. "Don't worry, dear," she whispered. "We'll make sure everything is handled properly." My father nodded along. Confidence etched into every movement. They truly believed they already knew how this would end. Mr. Klein turned a page, his voice steady. "This will was signed and notarized 1 year before Mr. Lawson's passing." My parents leaned forward. Logan reclined, one arm slung lazily over the back of his chair, waiting for the words he thought were coming. But what came next cut through the room like a blade through glass. "I, Henry Lawson, do hereby leave the entirety of my estate valued at approximately $5 billion to my granddaughter, Clara Whitfield." Silence fell so complete I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. My parents froze. My mother's smile faltered, her mouth opening just enough for the color to drain from her face. My father's fingers tightened against his knee. Logan's chair creaked as he sat up straight, the smirk gone, his jaw locked. The next words landed one by one, deliberate and final. "It is my express wish," Mr. Klein continued, "that this estate be left in her sole possession. No trustees, no shared management, no conditional oversight." The sound of my heartbeat filled my ears. I sat motionless, my hands pressed together under the table. My parents were the first to recover. My mother clapped her hands once too brightly. "Well, of course that makes sense," she said quickly. "Clara was always close to her grandfather." She turned to my father. "Naturally, she'll need our guidance. Won't she, Gerald?" My father nodded. The movement stiff, his voice strained but measured. "Yes, of course. $5 billion is a tremendous responsibility for someone so inexperienced." Logan gave a low laugh, the kind people use to disguise panic. "Don't take it the wrong way, Clara," he said lightly. "But you've never exactly been the responsible type. Dad knows investments. Mom knows people. Together we can make sure you don't make a mess of this." I didn't answer. Mr. Klein cleared his throat again, firm now. To clarify, he said, "Mr. Lawson's instructions are explicit. The estate belongs solely to Ms. Whitfield. No trustees, no family oversight." My father's jaw clenched, his voice dropping into that familiar tone he used when he wanted obedience. "We're only concerned for your well-being," he said. "You understand that, don't you, Clara?" My mother leaned in again, nails digging slightly deeper into my arm. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "we only want what's best. Grandpa would want us all to benefit." That word, benefit, hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't love they were after, it was control. I kept my face still the way you do when stillness is the only armor you have left. My heart pounded, but my voice stayed calm. I thanked Mr. Klein, stood, and walked out before they could say another word. The hallway air felt sharp and clean against my skin. Behind me, I could still hear their voices rising, demanding explanations that would never come. Outside, the sky was gray and soft, the kind of gray that makes you see your breath when you exhale. I stopped at the courthouse steps, took one deep breath, and finally let my shoulders fall. Grandpa had trusted me, only me. Whatever came next, that truth would have to be enough. And as I looked out across the street, the courthouse doors closing behind me, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The courthouse doors closed behind me, but their voices followed sharp and muffled through the glass. My mother's tone rose first, then my father's layered with that same rehearsed calm that used to silence me at the dinner table. I didn't turn back. The air outside felt cold, clean, and different, like it belonged to me now. I walked to my car with my keys tight in my palm and told myself to breathe. For a moment, I sat behind the wheel, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the courthouse steps where my family still stood inside. I should have felt triumphant, but all I felt was quiet disbelief. Grandpa's voice echoed faintly in my mind, the way he used to say, "You'll know your strength when you finally stop asking for permission." I didn't know what that strength looked like yet, but I could feel it waking up. By the time I got home that evening, my phone was buzzing nonstop. The screen filled with missed calls and messages from my mother. Each one carried the same tone disguised as concern. "Sweetheart, we just want to help. Don't make any rash decisions. Call us before you do anything foolish." I didn't answer. The words weren't new. They were the same ones I'd grown up hearing, polished with false affection. I set the phone face down on the counter and stood there for a long time, letting the stillness fill the room. Outside, the streetlight flickered, painting long shadows across my living room wall. For the first time in years, the silence felt safe. That safety didn't last long. 2 nights later, there was a knock at my door. It was late, close to midnight. The sound startled me. It was firm, confident, too familiar. When I opened the door, Logan stood there, leaning against the frame in his expensive jacket, that same smirk fixed in place. "You look surprised," he said, glancing past me into the apartment. "You really should upgrade Clara. A billionaire living like this embarrassing." He brushed past me before I could speak, settling on the couch like he owned it. "What do you want?" I asked. "Relax," he said, stretching out. "I'm here to make sure you don't ruin this for all of us." He spoke slowly, as if he were explaining something to a child. "Dad knows money, Mom knows people, I know vision. Together we can take what Grandpa built and make it bigger, but if you try to handle it alone, you'll drown." I stayed by the door, arms crossed. "It's not yours to handle," I said quietly. His smirk wavered just for a moment, then returned sharper. "You really think you can do this? You couldn't even keep up with rent last year." The words landed heavy, but not like they used to. I opened the door wider. "Good night, Logan." For the first time, he looked uncertain, his voice dropping to a hiss. "You'll regret this." I didn't answer. He finally stood brushing off his jacket and walked out without another word. The door closed behind him with a quiet click that felt final. The next morning, my mother appeared. No knock, no hesitation, just the sound of her heels clicking across the floor as she let herself in. She wore a fitted navy dress, the kind she saved for social luncheons. "Clara," she said, her voice bright and clipped, "I wish you'd told me you were struggling with this." She sat at the small table by the window, smoothing her skirt. "All this money, it can be overwhelming. Let us help you shoulder the burden." Her eyes moved around the room, judging every inch of it the way she'd judged me all my life. I remembered that same look when I was 16, standing beside her at one of her parties, my dress a little too plain, my hair not styled enough. She'd smiled through gritted teeth and whispered, "At least try not to look like a guest in your own family." Now, years later, she was back to rearrange my life piece by piece. "Think of this as a family effort," she said sweetly. "It's what your grandfather would have wanted." I met her gaze. "No," I said. "It's what you want." Her smile froze. "Don't be ungrateful," she murmured. "You'll thank us one day." She left without slamming the door, but the echo of her perfume lingered long after she was gone. By evening, my apartment felt smaller. Every shadow seemed sharper, every sound heavier. I sat at the table, her words circling like moths in the dark. Maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't strong enough. The thought came uninvited, soft but poisonous. I reached for the drawer beside me and found an old envelope tucked beneath a pile of papers. It was worn at the edges, sealed years ago on my 21st birthday. Grandpa had handed it to me then, with a half smile. "One day you'll understand," he'd said. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter inside was written in his neat, slightly shaky handwriting. "Clara," it began. "If you're reading this, it means the time has come to stand alone. The world takes what it can. Don't let it. You have more strength than you realize, and one day you'll need to prove it. When that moment comes, don't shrink. Stand tall. They can only take what you give away." I read it twice, then again, until the words blurred. The room felt different when I looked up brighter somehow, though the light hadn't changed. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it flat, and tucked it into my sketchbook. That night I made a quiet promise to myself. No more defending, no more explaining. If they wanted to fight, they'd find I wasn't the same girl they had thrown out years ago. The next week tested that promise sooner than I expected. I was at work when my phone buzzed. It was Mr. Cole, my grandfather's attorney, his voice tight. "Clara, I need to ask, did you authorize anyone to access the estate accounts?" My stomach dropped. "No," I said quickly. He exhaled sharply. "Someone presented themselves at the bank claiming to represent you. They had identification, even documents. Fortunately, the safeguards your grandfather established flagged the attempt. The funds are secure, but they were persistent." I didn't have to ask who it was. I could picture it too easily. My father's practiced authority, my mother's sugar-sweet tone, Logan's arrogance backing it all. I thanked him and hung up my pulse, still racing. That night I drove past their house. It looked exactly the same as it always had. The manicured lawn, the soft yellow light spilling through the curtains, the perfect porch swing that had never once creaked under my weight. It should have comforted me, but all I saw now was pretense. They weren't just manipulative anymore, they were desperate. I sat there for a long time watching the windows glow, then drove away before the anger could take root. Days later, the whispers began. At first it was small things, the woman at the grocery store giving me a quick pitying glance, the neighbor who used to wave now pretending not to see me. Then the comments started. "Must be nice living off an old man's fortune. Some people just get lucky." At the gas station, someone muttered, "She stole it from her brother." It spread fast, the way gossip always does in towns that survive on it. People who once smiled at me crossed the street. A few friends stopped calling. I could almost hear my parents behind it stitching the story carefully, making sure it fit the picture they wanted the world to see. One night, I sat at my kitchen table with the blinds drawn. The letter from Grandpa lay open beside my cup of tea. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I traced the edge of his handwriting with my thumb. The fear I'd carried for years began to settle into something sharper, steadier. I knew what he'd meant now about proving strength. It wasn't about fighting for power, it was about refusing to hand it away. I opened my notebook and began to write everything down, every message, every threat, every attempt they'd made to twist the truth. If they wanted to drag me through mud, I would keep a record clean enough to outlast them. Outside, a storm rolled in soft thunder, rumbling in the distance. I watched the rain streak the window, the glass blurring the world beyond it. I felt the ache of exhaustion, but beneath it, a small current of calm. They had underestimated me all my life, and maybe that was my greatest advantage. I closed the notebook and turned off the light, the letter still pressed under my hand. When morning came, the air was clearer, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. Grandpa had left me more than an inheritance. He'd left me a map. It was time to start following it. The morning after the storm, I woke to the sound of rainwater dripping from the balcony rail. The city felt cleaner somehow, like it had rinsed away everything false. I made coffee and sat by the window, the letter from Grandpa still resting on the table beside me. The ink had faded a little, but the words hadn't lost their weight. "Don't shrink. Stand tall." I traced those lines with my thumb and knew I couldn't keep waiting for peace to find me. I'd have to build it myself. That day, I called the only person I could think of who wasn't tied to my parents' world. A coworker had once mentioned a financial advisor who didn't deal in flash or flattery, a man who preferred paper ledgers to shiny portfolios. His name was Peter Ames. When I met him, he looked exactly as described: gray hair, calm eyes, a yellow legal pad tucked under his arm. He listened more than he spoke. I told him about the inheritance, the harassment, the bank incident. He didn't react with shock or excitement, only nodded thoughtfully, then asked, "What do you want this money to mean?" The question caught me off guard. I had been bracing for judgment, not curiosity. "I just want to make something honest out of it," I said finally. "Something that lasts." Peter smiled faintly, scribbled a few notes, and said, "Then that's where we'll start." By the time I left his office, I felt something I hadn't in months: steady ground under my feet. That night, for the first time since the will reading, I slept without waking in the middle of the night. With Peter's help, the next few weeks took on shape. We started small. He taught me how to set up an independent trust structure, separate from anything my parents could touch. We talked about risk, security, and legacy. He never made me feel small for asking simple questions. When I told him I wanted a home, not a mansion, he nodded. "Then we'll find something you can breathe in, not something that swallows you." I found it 2 weeks later, a modest craftsman house on the edge of town with a deep porch and quiet trees out front. It wasn't grand, but the air inside felt kind. When I turned the key in the door for the first time, the sound of the latch clicking closed felt like a promise. No one could throw me out of this place. I stood in the empty living room, sunlight streaming across the floorboards, and whispered softly, "This is mine." But even as I started to build, I knew money alone wouldn't protect me. My parents had always been skilled at shaping public stories. They could twist truth into rumor faster than I could correct it. So I decided to reclaim something stronger than gossip: respect. I began attending the community foundation my grandfather had once supported. At first I stayed quiet, listening at the back of the room. People whispered about me, of course. I heard fragments. "She's the heir, Henry Lawson's granddaughter, the one who got everything." I ignored them. I kept showing up. Over time, they started to see me not as a headline, but as a person. I helped organize charity auctions, filed paperwork, and joined late-night volunteer shifts. When the board chair called me reliable, it felt better than any compliment I'd ever gotten at home. Slowly, the look softened. The gossip faded. My grandfather's name became a bridge instead of a burden, and I felt like I was finally walking towards something of my own making. Then came a shift I hadn't expected. At one of those board meetings, I met Martin Cole, a retired attorney in his 50s, with a calm, deliberate voice. He had once worked with my grandfather years ago on a local development project. When he learned who I was, his eyes softened. "Your grandfather was a rare man," he said quietly. "He always spoke well of you." A week later, he called and asked to meet for coffee. We sat by the window of a small cafe, the kind that smelled like cinnamon and roasted beans. After a few minutes of conversation, his tone changed. "Clara," he said, lowering his voice, "your grandfather anticipated trouble. He put protections in place before he passed." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents, legal amendments notarized and sealed. I flipped through the pages, my breath catching. "These clauses," Martin explained, "ensure that if your parents or anyone else attempts to claim your inheritance or represent you, they are automatically disqualified from any benefit. Your grandfather wanted you safe." I stared at the papers, my chest tight. He knew I murmured. Martin nodded. He saw more clearly than he ever let on. He trusted that you'd find your footing when the time came. When I left the cafe, I sat in my car for a long moment, the folder open on the passenger seat. My grandfather hadn't just left me money, he'd left me a shield. Every clause, every notarized line was proof that he'd believed in my strength, even when I hadn't. For years, my parents had told me I wasn't capable of standing on my own, and now from beyond the grave, Grandpa had given me evidence to the contrary. The next few days moved quickly. Martin reviewed the protections with Peter, and together they built a secure framework around the estate. Everything my grandfather had owned his company shares real estate holdings, even the small investments, was now tied to legal safeguards they couldn't touch. "They'll try again," Peter warned gently. "People like that always do, but next time they'll hit a wall." He was right. A week later, I received a formal notice my parents had filed a petition with the court claiming I was unfit to manage the inheritance. They wanted guardianship over the estate. The audacity of it would have shocked me once. Now it only confirmed what I already knew. I called Martin, and his calm voice steadied me. "We'll handle it," he said. "Your grandfather prepared for this exact thing. In the days before the hearing, I tried to go about my life as usual, but the tension followed me everywhere. People at the foundation whispered again, but this time their pity felt different, heavier, more cautious. I kept my focus on what I could control, reading, planning, making lists. I refused to give my parents the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. On the morning of the hearing, the sky was clear and sharp, the kind of cold that wakes you up all the way. I chose a simple navy suit, my hair pulled back neatly, nothing that could be read as arrogance or fear. The courthouse was the same as before, marble floors, echoing halls, but this time I wasn't walking in alone. Peter and Martin flanked me on either side, quiet and steady. Across the aisle, my parents and Logan sat together like a portrait they'd rehearsed, calm, respectable, concerned. My mother's smile was as polished as ever. My father's expression was pure calculation. Logan fidgeted, pretending indifference. Their attorney spoke first, his words dripping with false concern. "Your Honor, my clients are deeply worried for their daughter. She has no financial experience, no history of managing such an estate. It would be irresponsible to leave $5 billion under her control." Every sentence felt like déjà vu, different words, same condescension. I watched my mother dab at her eyes, my father nodding solemnly, Logan folding his hands like a dutiful son. It was theater, and they were sure the audience would buy it. Then Martin rose. His voice didn't rise or tremble. "Your Honor," he began, "this is not a case of concern. It's a case of greed." He laid out the evidence one by one, the forged bank attempt, the threatening messages, the manipulative letters. Then he pulled out the folder, the one my grandfather had prepared, and handed it to the judge. "These are Mr. Lawson's own words and wishes, notarized and sealed." He anticipated this. He made it clear that no one but Ms. Whitfield is to control the estate. The courtroom grew quiet. My mother's hand froze mid-clutch of her pearls. My father's jaw tightened. Logan's eyes dropped to the table. When the judge finally spoke, her tone was calm but firm. "The petition is denied. The estate remains in the sole control of Ms. Whitfield. Any further interference will be considered a violation of Mr. Lawson's documented wishes." The gavel struck once sharp and final. My parents didn't move. My mother tried to speak, but her voice caught. My father muttered something I couldn't make out. Logan stormed out first, his footsteps echoing against the marble. I stood slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. For the first time, I wasn't the child defending myself against their voices. I was the woman my grandfather had known I'd become, the one who didn't shrink. Outside, the sunlight hit the courthouse steps just right, casting long shadows behind me. Peter smiled faintly. "You handled that with grace," he said. Martin placed a hand on my shoulder. "Your grandfather would be proud." I nodded, the words settling deep. The battle was over, at least in the courtroom. But I knew the war wasn't done. The damage to their reputation, the fractures within the family that would come next. And when it did, I'd be ready to face it. When I stepped out of the courthouse that afternoon, the cold air felt sharper, cleaner, almost like the world itself had been waiting for this moment. For the first time in years, my parents couldn't touch me. Not my money, not my name, not my peace. The judgment had stripped them of any claim to my grandfather's estate, and yet I knew what losing control would do to them. Power wasn't something they shared. It was something they clung to until their knuckles went white. Peter drove me home afterward, his steady silence saying more than comfort ever could. "You did well," he said finally, as we turned onto my street. I nodded, my hands folded in my lap. "It's strange," I said quietly. "I thought it would feel like victory." He smiled faintly. Justice rarely feels loud, Clara. It just settles in and stays. In the days that followed, that quiet began to take shape. The petition had been denied publicly, and word traveled fast in our town. My parents had built their reputation on charm and polish. Now that same shine turned brittle under the weight of the truth. I didn't seek revenge. It found them in the one place they couldn't control public perception. It started small. My mother's circle at the country club, the same women who used to hang on her every word, began to pull away. Luncheons that once included her suddenly didn't. When she arrived uninvited, conversations hushed, then shifted politely elsewhere. A few whispered apologies reached me through acquaintances. "We had no idea what she put you through." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. My father faced his own reckoning. At his firm, the partners had read the court filings, the failed guardianship petition, the evidence of forged documents, the clear record of manipulation. His credibility once his armor became his downfall. Clients began canceling meetings. Some demanded new representation. Within weeks, rumors of retirement surfaced, though everyone knew it wasn't voluntary. As for Logan, his fall came quicker. His entire identity had been built on the illusion of being untouchable, the golden son, the heir apparent. After the hearing, that illusion cracked. His friends, the ones who used to orbit him, quietly disappeared. I heard later that his longtime girlfriend had ended things, unable to handle the embarrassment that followed him everywhere. He moved back into my parents' house, the same house that had once been their stage for perfection. 3 fractured egos now shared the same roof, bound together by bitterness. While their world shrank, mine began to grow in quiet, steady ways. The foundation work that had once felt small now filled my days with purpose. People started to seek me out for advice or support, not because of my last name, but because I showed up and stayed consistent. When the board chair asked me to lead an upcoming fundraiser, I hesitated. Old habits die hard, but Peter encouraged me. "You've earned their respect," he said. "Now let them see the person your grandfather saw." The night of the event, I stood backstage in a simple black dress, listening to the hum of conversation beyond the curtain. When the host called my name, I stepped into the light. The applause wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was real, the kind that comes from people who've watched you rebuild yourself. I spoke about Henry Lawson, the man who taught me that kindness wasn't weakness, and that the measure of strength was what you built for others, not what you took for yourself. When the evening ended, we had raised enough to fund an entire year of local outreach programs. I drove home in silence, the kind of silence that feels full instead of empty. That same week, I invited Peter and Martin over for dinner. It wasn't a celebration, just gratitude. The 3 of us sat around my small dining table with simple food laughter filling spaces that used to hold uncertainty. Afterward, as Martin was leaving, he paused at the door. "Henry would be proud," he said softly. "Not because you won, because you carried yourself with grace." His words stayed with me long after the sound of his car faded down the street. A few nights later, I took a drive out of habit, more than purpose. The road curved past familiar landmarks, the school, the park, the same street where I'd once sat in my car at 18, afraid of what came next. When I reached my parents' neighborhood, the air felt different, heavier still. Their house looked almost the same from the outside, but the small things told the story: the once perfect lawn now patchy, the porch light flickering, a crack running down one of the front steps. I parked across the street and sat there for a while, engine idling. Through the front window, I could see the faint glow of the chandelier, the one my mother had insisted came from Italy. It hung over a dinner table that looked emptier than I remembered. For a long moment, I just watched the shadows move inside. Then I rolled down the window and let the night air in. It was cool and smelled faintly of pine. I thought about that girl in the car years ago, the one with a backpack and no plan who thought she had lost everything. I wanted to tell her she'd make it here, that the pain wouldn't last forever. But some things you can only learn by living through them. I didn't go to the door. I didn't need to. Whatever apology they might someday offer or excuse they might craft couldn't change what had already been said in court. Some truths didn't need repeating. I shifted the car into gear, the headlights sweeping across the worn siding of the house as I turned away. When I reached home, the porch light I'd left on glowed softly against the steps. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar from the small box of my grandfather's things I kept on the shelf. His old fountain pen, a pocket watch, and the letter that had started it all. I sat at the kitchen table and unfolded it again, reading the lines that had once felt like prophecy. Don't shrink. Stand tall. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trees, but inside it was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, not empty, but earned. I closed the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. Tomorrow I would return to the foundation, to new projects, new people. The war was over, and the aftermath was mine to shape. As I turned off the light and started up the stairs, I looked back once more at the letter resting on the table. It was a reminder and a promise, one I intended to keep. The world my parents built had fallen apart in silence. The one my grandfather believed I could create was just beginning to take form. And somewhere between the two, I had finally found my place. The weeks after the hearing felt strangely quiet, as if the noise of the courtroom had drained the air around me. The calls stopped, the messages slowed, and even the gossip that used to find its way into my days began to fade. For the first time, I could think clearly without looking over my shoulder. Yet that calm also brought a kind of emptiness, the pause that follows a storm when you're not sure what to rebuild first. I filled my time with work at the foundation. The more hours I spent there, the more the space began to feel like home. We started a mentorship program for local students interested in community projects, and I poured myself into it. I wanted to give them what my grandfather had given me, a reason to believe they were capable of more than anyone had told them. The quiet rhythm of those days healed something in me that I hadn't realized was still bruised. I could walk through the office, greet the volunteers, and feel purpose instead of pressure. But outside that little circle of work and peace, my family's world was coming apart. I heard about it in fragments. My mother's friends at the club no longer returned her calls. The charity committee she once chaired quietly replaced her name on the rosters. My father's firm finalized his early retirement, the official letter calling it mutual agreement. And Logan, he was back in town, still living with them, seen less and less. Word traveled that he'd been passed over for a promotion at his company in the city, that he spent his days brooding and his nights drinking. None of them reached out to me. One evening, as I locked up the foundation's office, a familiar car pulled up across the street. I didn't need to see the license plate to know it was them. My father stepped out first, then my mother, her posture as rigid as ever. They crossed the street slowly, and I stood by the door waiting. "Clara," my father said, voice, careful, rehearsed. "We need to talk." My mother gave a strained smile. "You've made quite a name for yourself," she said, glancing at the building behind me. "Your grandfather would be proud." I said nothing. My father cleared his throat. "We wanted to say we're sorry for how things turned out." He paused, then added quickly, "We all made mistakes, but the family's taken quite a blow, and we were hoping we could find a way forward, together." The word hung there heavy and hollow. I looked at both of them, their clothes immaculate, their expressions fragile in the fading light. I thought of the years they'd spent cutting me down the way they'd stood in court, calling me unfit, and how quickly they'd turned when the wind changed. "I appreciate you coming," I said finally, "but there's nothing left to fix." My mother's face tightened. "Don't be dramatic, Clara. We're family." I stepped aside and gestured toward the street. "Then be family to each other. I've already made my peace." My father exhaled, frustrated. "You don't have to shut us out completely." "You made that choice for me a long time ago," I said quietly. For a moment, none of us moved. Then my mother turned her heels, clicking against the pavement as she walked away. My father lingered as if he wanted to say more, then followed her without another word. When their car disappeared down the road, I felt no anger, just relief. That door had closed not with violence, but with certainty. It was the ending my grandfather had foreseen when he wrote his will. He'd given me the tools to stand alone, and now I finally had. Over the next few months, life took on a slower rhythm. I spent weekends working in my garden mornings, reading on the porch with a cup of coffee, evenings planning new programs for the foundation. The house that had once felt too quiet now felt peaceful. I learned to enjoy that silence, the hum of a place that belonged entirely to me. Then one afternoon in early spring, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. The handwriting was familiar, neat, but slightly uneven. It was from Martin Cole. Inside was a short note and a single page printed from an old file. Henry Lawson, Memorial Fund approved expansion proposal. Martin had written beneath it. He'd started this before he passed. I think he wanted you to finish it. The project outlined a small educational center on the edge of town, a place where anyone, regardless of income, could learn business technology or trade skills for free. My grandfather had sketched it out himself years before, but hadn't lived to see it built. I held the page for a long time, tracing the faded ink, and felt something inside me click into place. It wasn't just a plan. It was the continuation of everything he'd believed in. I called Peter the next morning and told him I wanted to fund it personally. It's what he would have wanted, I said. Then it's what we'll do, he replied. Within months, we secured the land and began construction. By summer, the first building stood framed against the sky, a modest structure of brick and glass that felt both new and familiar. I visited the site often, walking the grounds, as workers hammered and measured. Each sound reminded me of him, steady, deliberate, enduring. On the day the center opened, the air was warm and the sky clear. People from the community came in small groups, teachers, parents, students, retirees. I stood near the entrance, greeting them one by one, when the ribbon was cut and the doors opened. I stepped back to take it all in. Sunlight poured through the windows, catching the bronze plaque by the door. The Lawson Learning Center, founded in honor of Henry Lawson, by his granddaughter Clara Whitfield. Later that evening, after the crowd dispersed, I stayed behind. The halls were quiet again, the smell of fresh paint still faint in the air. I sat on one of the benches near the entrance and thought about the path that had brought me here. My parents' cruelty, the long silence, the courtroom battles, they had all felt unbearable once. Now they felt distant, like another lifetime. My grandfather had built more than an inheritance. He had left a map, one that led me back to myself. Before I left, I walked out to the garden behind the building where a small stone stood beneath a young oak tree. The inscription read simply, "Steady Clara," the phrase he'd said to me 100 times now carved into stone. I brushed my fingers over the letters and felt the calm that used to come whenever he spoke those words. The sun was setting when I reached my car. The light caught the glass windows of the new center, turning them gold. As I drove away, I could see people still lingering outside, taking pictures, smiling, talking. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something that would outlast us all. When I got home that night, I set the framed photo of my grandfather on the mantel beside the letter he'd written me years ago. The words had guided every step since. Don't shrink. Stand tall. They had carried me through fear, through loss, through the hardest kind of love, the kind that requires letting go. Outside, the crickets started up in the yard, and a soft breeze moved through the trees. The house was quiet, but not empty. It was the sound of a life rebuilt from the inside out. And though I didn't say it aloud, I knew the truth of it. Now he hadn't just left me his fortune. He'd left me his faith. Tomorrow I would return to the center and begin the work ahead. There was more to build, more to give, and this time I wasn't building alone. The town had taken notice, and new partners were reaching out. The next chapter was already waiting, steady, certain, and finally entirely my own. The Lawson Learning Center had been open for nearly a year when the letters started arriving, notes from teachers, parents, even strangers who'd driven from neighboring towns just to see what we'd built. They wrote about how the programs were changing lives, how kids who had dropped out of school were now learning trades, how retired professionals were volunteering their time to teach others. Each envelope carried a piece of what my grandfather had envisioned long before I understood what he meant by legacy. Every morning, I'd stop by the center before heading to the foundation. The sun came through the glass panels, warming the lobby's polished floor, and I'd stand there for a minute just listening to the sounds of it all, voices in classrooms, the click of keyboards, laughter echoing down the hall. That place had grown into something bigger than me. It had become proof that what my grandfather started could keep moving long after he was gone. But outside those walls, the story of my family still hung like a shadow. Word had spread about the courtroom outcome, and people now looked at my parents differently. It wasn't my doing, it was the truth finally settling into the open. One evening, Martin called to tell me a local paper had published an editorial about the case, calling it a reminder that legacy follows integrity, not inheritance. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't angry. I wasn't proud. It just felt inevitable. Over the following months, I noticed how the balance had shifted. My parents, once the center of attention, were now spoken of in quiet tones. My mother's friends kept their distance, invitations stopped coming, and the family name, once their badge of status, had lost its shine. My father retreated into silence. He'd resigned from the board of his firm claiming health reasons, though everyone knew better. Logan tried to rebuild his own image, but his name still came up in connection with the petition. When he applied for new jobs, doors closed before he even walked through them. I didn't take satisfaction in any of it. Some part of me just wanted peace for all of us. But peace doesn't come from pretending nothing happened. It comes from facing what did. One afternoon, I received a call from Peter. His tone was measured as always. "Clara, he said your brother reached out. He asked if you'd be willing to meet." I hesitated, my hand tightening on the phone. Did he say why Peter paused? He said he wants to make things right. But that's for you to decide. It took me 2 days to answer. When I finally called Logan back, his voice sounded smaller than I remembered. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Just once." I agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe downtown. When I arrived, he was already there, seated in the corner with his hands folded on the table. He looked older, his hair shorter, his posture uncertain. For the first time, he didn't look like the golden boy who'd once ruled every room he entered. He looked like someone who had finally been humbled. "Thanks for coming," he said as I sat down. His eyes didn't meet mine right away. "I owe you an apology." I didn't interrupt. He took a slow breath. I thought I understood what it meant to earn something, but I didn't. Mom and Dad always told me I deserved everything, and I believed them. I let their version of love define what I thought mattered. His voice broke slightly. "When Grandpa left everything to you, I thought he was punishing me. But I see now he was trusting you with something he knew I couldn't handle then." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The clatter of dishes from the counter filled the silence. Finally, he looked up. "I'm trying to start over," he said quietly. "I'm working at a local nonprofit handling logistics. It's small, but it's honest. I want to do better. I want to be better." I watched him carefully. His words felt genuine. Not rehearsed, not polished, just human. "You don't owe me perfection," I said softly. "Just honesty." He nodded, eyes glistening. "That's the plan." We talked for nearly an hour, about the past, about how everything had spiraled, about our parents still clinging to denial. When we stood to leave, he reached out a hand, then hesitated. I stepped forward and hugged him instead. It wasn't forgiveness all at once, but it was a start. That night I drove home under a sky thick with stars. The world felt larger than it had in a long time. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw the porch light glowing against the siding, steady and warm. Inside, the framed photograph of my grandfather sat on the mantel beside the letter he'd written me. I touched the edge of the frame and whispered, "We're getting there." Over the next few weeks, Logan began volunteering at the Learning Center on weekends. He helped organize supply drives and assisted students with job placement forms. The first time I saw him there, I stayed quiet, watching from the hallway. He wasn't performing. He was working earnestly, humbly. It reminded me of my grandfather's words, "They can only take what you hand to them." Eventually, the town started to see the Whitfield name differently. Not through scandal or status, but through work, real steady work. The foundation grew, partnerships expanded, and a few months later, we were recognized with a state award for community development. I stood on stage with our team as they handed me the plaque. In the front row, I spotted Logan clapping with quiet pride. After the ceremony, he found me backstage. "You've changed everything," he said. I shook my head. "No, we have. Grandpa would have wanted that." He smiled, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel forced. There was no rivalry left, just relief. Before he left, he said, "Mom asked about you. She doesn't say it, but she regrets a lot." I nodded. "Maybe one day we'll talk, but not yet." He understood. Some wounds need time, not conversation. That evening, I drove out to the old Lawson estate, my grandfather's property, the one that had started this whole journey. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the windows in shades of gold and rose. I walked through the garden path where we used to sit, the air still carrying the faint scent of cedar and soil. The bench where he once read the paper was still there, worn but sturdy. I sat down, resting my hands on the cool wood. The wind moved through the trees, whispering the kind of quiet you don't get in the city. I thought about the years I'd spent chasing approval, about the nights I'd doubted myself, and how every step, even the painful ones, had led here to a life built not from revenge, but from peace. When I finally stood to leave, the last light of day caught the edge of the horizon, the same golden hue that used to spill across his porch. I smiled, a small, quiet thing. The world he'd wanted me to inherit wasn't measured in money or power. It was this dignity, freedom, and the steady rhythm of a life I had chosen for myself. Tomorrow there would be new challenges, new work, maybe even new forgiveness. But as I locked the gate behind me and headed toward the car, I knew one thing for certain. My grandfather's legacy wasn't something written in his will. It was living in me now. I left the old Lawson estate just as the sky shifted from gold to blue, the horizon fading behind me like a page being turned. The gravel crunched under my tires as I drove away, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to look back. The house, the memories, even the shadows of the people I used to chase after, they all belonged to another life. What lay ahead felt lighter, quieter, and entirely my own. In the months that followed, the world around me began to settle into something that felt like peace. The foundation's work grew beyond anything I could have imagined. The Learning Center expanded to 3 new locations across the state, each one carrying my grandfather's name. People started calling it the Lawson Legacy, though to me, it had always been about something simpler, giving others the chance to stand on steady ground the way he once helped me. Logan stayed in town. He still volunteered on weekends, helping with the logistics team and mentoring younger volunteers. There were moments when we'd stand side by side at events, both quiet, both still learning how to rebuild what family meant. It wasn't the kind of reconciliation that comes with grand gestures or perfect words. It was quieter than that. A shared nod, a knowing glance, a peace that didn't need to be explained. My parents never returned to public life. I heard through others that they sold the old house and moved to a smaller one near the coast. I didn't see them again, but sometimes I thought about them, how power and pride had consumed so much of what could have been love. I didn't wish them harm. I simply wished them peace, the kind that comes only when you finally stop fighting the truth. At home, my days found a gentle rhythm. I spent mornings walking the garden, afternoons, meeting with the board, and evenings on the porch with a book or a cup of tea. The same porch light glowed every night when I came home, steady as the heartbeat of a life rebuilt. There were no more locked doors, no more waiting for approval, just quiet gratitude for the life I'd been strong enough to protect. Sometimes I'd catch myself thinking about my grandfather, not just about the man he was, but about the lessons he left stitched into every part of my life. His voice came back into me in small moments, when I signed a scholarship form, when I handed out certificates to students at the center, or when I watched someone find their footing for the first time. He used to say, "Steady, Clara," and I finally understood that steadiness wasn't about staying still, it was about staying true. There's a calm that comes when you stop living for the people who doubted you and start living for the person you've become. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in quiet mornings and long nights in the choices no one else sees. For me, it was the moment I realized that forgiveness didn't mean reopening old doors. It meant walking forward without bitterness, free at last from the weight of their expectations. The legacy my grandfather left wasn't $5 billion. It was the belief that a life built on kindness and integrity would always outlast greed. It was the reminder that standing tall doesn't mean being unshaken. It means refusing to let cruelty harden you. Now when I walk through the Lawson Center's front hall and see the light spilling across the polished floors, I think of that frightened girl who once slept in her car and wondered how she'd ever survive. I wish she could see this version of herself, the woman who stood through every storm and came out whole. She didn't just inherit an empire, she built a life with meaning. Before I leave each evening, I pause by the plaque in the lobby. My name sits below his, carved in bronze, not as a mark of wealth, but as a testament to what we built from love. I trace the letters once, then step outside into the fading light. The world feels bigger now, but it also feels gentler. And if there's one truth that's carried me through it all, it's this: sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the life you choose to live after the battle ends. So to anyone listening who's ever been told they're not enough, don't shrink. Stand tall. Build your own steady ground, one honest step at a time. And if this story found you tonight, take a moment to share your thoughts or your own story below. I'd love to know where your strength has led you.